The moderator for this panel is Casey Fiesler, a fellow with Silicon Flatirons, as well as an assistant professor for information science at the University of Colorado Boulder. A warm welcome to Casey and to the panel.
Good morning, everyone. I wish very much that I could be seeing you all in person. We actually have a lovely dusting of snow in Boulder this morning. And I'm also very pleased to be moderating the very first panel of this conference on the topic of law and ethics for thinking about trust in the tech sector. So first, I'm going to allow each of our panelists to make some opening remarks. And so I will introduce them in turn as we get to each of them. So we are going to start with Jasmine McNeely. Professor McNeely is an associate professor of telecommunication at the University of Florida. Thank you for joining us, Professor McNeely. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Casey, and thank you for doing the human wrangling for this panel as well. And thank you to all the Silicon Flatirons folks, especially Amy, for this opportunity. So I want to think about trust and different communities and different kind of communities, particularly communities that historically don't have a lot of trust in technology. And those reasons for not trusting technology are very valid. And we need to recognize the validity of different communities, particularly marginalized and vulnerable communities, just not trusting tech organizations, government, civil society, various other kinds of organizations where there's a concentration of power, and also tools that help reify that concentration of power. So like, what is trust in the first place? So if we consider trust just to be a willingness to be vulnerable with someone or something or an organization, then there are various rationales for not trusting in technology or tech organizations, both contextual and related to kind of perceived integrity of the organizations. If I were De La Soul, I would say stakes is high, right? But stakes are high when you have to be vulnerable, because the impacts of vulnerability are so devastating to various communities. We've seen stories over the past couple of years related to the use of algorithms in healthcare, for example, and how certain communities, particularly African Americans, were not getting things like triage because of algorithmic decision making. We're getting kicked off of kidney transplant lists because of algorithmic decision making. So stakes are certainly high. And history has borne out for specific communities that, trusting in certain processes and certain concentrations of power is not necessarily the best option. Of course, we can say Tuskegee, we can say various kinds of interactions that people have had with government, as well as other kinds of concentrations of power. And that includes technology and media, for that matter. But also, trust is about a relationship. Many organizations just do not have relationships with the communities that they are trying to get to trust them. This is based in the idea of many of the interactions that communities have had with organizations have been of an extractive nature. So we want this data, we want to use this data, we want to collect this information about you, and there's nothing in return that is of value. And there's no real true participation or engagement in the process. And we've seen the implications of participation or lack of participation. And of course, if you read Sasha Costanza's Trucks, Design Justice, there's ways forward for organizations and government related to actually getting people to engage and participate in the process. But when you lack that participation, there's no valid reason for communities to trust. And I've mentioned power for quite a few times in the past, few minutes, and I think we need to have a real, true conversation about what power is and how concentrations of power really are valid reasons for people not to trust. Because when there are certain kinds of concentrations of power, and then there's no accountability related to that power, there's a lack of incentive many times for organizations and other places to course correct or to change what they're doing. So where does law come in? Law has the possibility to change this concentration of power, to force ethical, and I don't even want to say ethical, but to force true engagement with people and communities. Law is normative, of course, but law can make a difference when we're talking about holding companies and organizations accountable, but governments accountable as well. And I think this is a true thing. So if we want trust, there has to be true accountability, and that would allow these communities and particularly vulnerable and marginalized to begin to start trusting in organizations and governments.
Great, thank you very much. So to build off of that conversation about communities, power, and trust, our next panelist is Professor Katie Shilton, who is an associate professor in the College of Information Studies at University of Maryland, College Park. So Dr. Shilton, I'm going to let you go next there.
Thanks so much. I'm also really thrilled to be here, and I'm super excited for our conversation today. I also want to talk a bit today about the intersection of law and specifically cultural norms. And I've been focused in a particular area of trust in the tech sector, which is trust in big data collection, or data collection, but I can see it called big data collection. And with Casey, actually, I've been part of a team studying ethics and norms in what we're calling pervasive data collection, digital data documenting people's interactions, movements, habits, and routines. And we set out as a group to answer the question of what constitutes trustworthy research treatments of pervasive data. So we're really interested in researchers and building trust with researchers, although I think that what I'm going to say today applies much more broadly, although it's a harder problem for tech companies even than it is for researchers. But in any case, what constitutes trustworthy research treatments of pervasive data, what the principles should be, what mechanisms support those principles. So our work has included surveys of people, of data subjects, analysis of big data research, and focus groups with groups such as IRBs that regulate research uses of big data. And it's become clear that explicit considerations of both awareness, of people's awareness of this kind of data collection, and also power, exactly as Jasmine said, are critical to using data in trustworthy ways. And so much of the legislative focus right now around big data is on awareness, often modeled in problematic ways in notice and consent, as we know. But understandings of power are being left out of this conversation, and understandings of power are contextual and nuanced, and reflection by technology researchers, by teams, by companies are going to be an important part of doing this well. And so as the team I've been working with, the Pervade team, has thought about trust, we've been inspired by a research background shared actually by many of our PIs, that of ethnographic data collection. I joke, I was trained as an ethnographer, and I joke that ethnographers were the original big data researchers. We sit there gathering multiple streams of data with our eyes and our ears, and making people uncomfortable with our presence. And I think this last bit is key. Ethnographers have long had to explicitly negotiate trust in order to study people. And as a field, ethnography has had a decades-long accounting with power and representation. Because the history of anthropology and ethnography is very explicitly tied to colonialism, ethnographers have had to rethink who they study and reflect on their power relative to the communities that they are studying. They frequently ask themselves things like, am I the right person to do this research? And we think that data scientists need to be asking similar questions. What does it mean to study people using big data? And does it truly serve people's interest to use that data? Building trust in data research is going to mean increasing not only the awareness of communities to this kind of research, but participation and reflexivity in pervasive data research. So I think a hard question for this panel, for today, for the future is how building such reflection into data collection processes should proceed. It's going to require cultural change in the communities of scientists who do this kind of work, alongside regulatory change, because exactly as Jasmine said, law has the ability to affect these levers of power. But how best to achieve that balance between sort of cultural change and normative change and regulatory change when we're talking about complex, nuanced, contextual situations, I think is an open question. So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have started to delve into how we think about communities and power and trust, most recently in the context of data. So next, we are going to hear from Dwayne Poza, who is a partner at Wiley Rein, advising on legal and regulatory issues of emerging technology, in order to talk a bit more specifically about AI. So I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, and thanks to Silicon Flatirons and to everyone putting on this great event. It's too bad I can't be in Boulder, but I hope we all get back together next year, whenever it's safe. So my background is, I'm a lawyer. I'm now in private practice. I spent 6.5 years at the Federal Trade Commission doing consumer protection in emerging technologies. And then in my current role now, I'm advising clients. One thing I do is advise clients on how to comply with evolving regulatory frameworks in tech areas where there might not be a clear answer. And but those are two very different vantage points. The time I spent at the FTC was, I think, pretty critical in terms of that agency's approach to trying to apply existing law to deal with emerging technology. And it has authorities to do that. In particular, it's Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Authority, UDAP. I know we're avoiding acronyms as much as possible, but it's a very flexible statute, the FTC Act, to try to identify practices that cause harm to consumers and take action. Now coming into the private sector, I'm actually pretty excited about the possibility of a lot of these conversations around, particularly in AI, which is a lot of what I work on, to sort of really engage with what trustworthiness and what some of these bedrock principles should be from the ground up. Without getting into the history of the way privacy has evolved, and it's not totally unrelated, but you can see in AI specifically that there is a recognition among a lot of people, probably not enough people, but at least a lot, that there needs to be a concept of trustworthiness that needs to be sort of developed from at least a legal and regulatory side, and also from an ethical side. I don't do as much on the ethical side, but there are plenty of folks who are very focused on it. And those have really converged. I think that if you look at what governments are doing, the OECD is doing, many large industry players are doing, civil society groups are doing, they are trying to build a language around trustworthiness in AI from the ground up. And I think this has been very interesting to watch and also to sort of participate in the way that, NIST, which is the National Institute of Science and Technology at the Department of Commerce, is doing a lot of work in this area. And then also to try to advise, the folks who I'm talking to in the private sector, what's this going to look like? Where is the regulation going to come? So we'll get into more detail, but I would say, at a high level, I think it is an opportunity to realize, and the conversation around trustworthiness in AI is, it's in no one's interest for people not to trust the technology, right? Because it won't be adopted, or it'll be misused, or there's a litany of things that could go off the rails because it's such a powerful technology. So given that, what are the kinds of things like protections against bias, or guardrails or having explainable outcomes so that people understand or have some idea of where it comes out in advance. And I think a lot of the work that's being done right now really is in places like NIST to conceptualize what are sort of these models being developed as a preface to what I think is eventually going to be a conversation about regulation or government enforcement. And regulation in that sense doesn't necessarily have to be overly prescriptive, and we can talk about that, but just what are the principles out there? You know, what are, for example, the guidelines that companies or any private entity should follow, or public entity for that matter, when it comes to avoiding bias, right? And what you have now is a patchwork of sector-specific laws, but I think we're definitely going to have a conversation, and law is going to play a big role in determining what the guardrails are around things like avoiding bias. And it all wraps up into this idea of trying to get to a trustworthy use of the technology.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, so to cap off our opening remarks here, next we have Martin Tisney, who's Managing Director at Luminate, specifically in their data and digital rights impact area. I will hand it over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thanks, Casey. So the question I'd like to talk about is building on the great presentations to question whether we're talking about individual trusts or the trust of groups, given what we know about the disparate impact of technology on marginalized groups, especially. I'd like to talk about the fact that trustworthiness is partly about process, and some of the key issues are transparency, participation, like empowered, real participation, and crucially accountability. And I think data protection is part of the solution, but alone it won't get us there. So at a high level, one of the issues for me is really helpful to understand is the degree to which the collective nature of data means that people are as impacted by other people's data than by data about them. And the issue of taking a purely data protection lens is it's really individualized. So I like to think about it more like climate change, where the threat is societal as well as personal. And as a result of that, the way that we should respond is both individual and collective. So if you think of it, looking at a different example, completely different example, but bear with me, you know, people have a right to safe drinking water, but the way that they exercise that right isn't purely individual by being encouraged to check the quality of the water with a little pipette every time their kids have a drink at the tap, right? The state takes on the collective responsibility and there's a process to do it. They trust the fact that the water will be safe for all communities. And so I think there's a real issue there that we need to interrogate. Some of the work I've done on that has been to look at the collective nature of data-driven harms, or what we're calling the collective nature of data-driven harms. I think it's helpful to think about it on the spectrum. Well, first you've got like really quite narrow individual harms. So for example, you know, person X is seen as unfit for employment due to data directly related to them, maybe their age, for example, and there are quite strong protections in law already for that. But then if you move the dial on the spectrum more towards those more collective harms, it gets knottier, right? There's like inferred harms, where the individual is inferred to be part of a group or category of people, but the person whose data is used is not harmed. So for example, there was a well-known case a couple of years ago of people uploading photos of themselves on a popular American dating website, and then researchers very controversially developed algorithms to ascertain people's sexuality based on their facial characteristics, right? It's an interesting example because the individuals whose photos were used, they weren't the ones harmed. It's the people whose sexualities was inferred, however spuriously, by the techniques who were the ones harmed. So that I think is a key one, which is sort of the people whose data is being used, how close are they actually to the harm? So I'll finish off by saying that I think the answer when we talk about trust is, again, to think about groups as well as thinking about individuals. Not to limit ourselves to data protection, and really to think about how to regulate algorithmic accountability. And when we think about trustworthiness, to think about the process. So to be specific about that, transparency about where and when automated decisions take place, their impact on people and groups, and specifically the types of transparency that lead to accountability. And there's a lot of scholarship on that from the Open Government, Transparency, Anti-Corruption, other communities. You know, we need to have the existent to know the existence, purpose, training data behind the algorithms. So that's one key piece. Another key piece is the right to give meaningful, not just any, but meaningful public inputs and real participation. So mandatory public input prior to the rollout of certain types of algorithms. We can talk about that more during the Q&As. And then the last one, as I mentioned, is like really teeth, like the ability to enforce sanctions. I think should be mandatory to establish auditing requirements for data targeting, profiling, verification, content curation, and really equip auditors with that baseline knowledge so that oversight bodies can enforce sanctions. So that's what I'm excited for us to focus on as an overall community and to discuss today. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So I am glad to have some of these framing conversations to get us started. I want to remind everyone that you can ask questions using the Q&A feature. I see we already have one, which is great. I'm going to start us off with a couple of questions, and then how long I go before I start taking questions from the audience will depend on how many questions you all ask. So it would be wonderful. Please feel free to leave some questions as we go along. And I also believe you can look at other people's questions and upvote them for what order we should answer them in. So we have the opportunity as the very first panel of the conference to consider some big questions. And I think that we've already kind of gotten started with this in some of your opening remarks, but there are a lot of different ways that we might think about what trust and trustworthiness is in this context, right? So there is the trust of individuals and of communities, trust in a technology to work properly, trust in a technology to not be biased, trust in a platform or a company to protect your data, or for researchers to use your data properly. A lot of different ways that I imagine we're going to hear trust talked about over the next few days. So I want to pose a question to each of you, and you can elaborate on comments that you've made previously or think about this in a different ways. So what are some ways of thinking about what trust is? And how do you see some aspect, you can pick your favorite, of law or ethics impacting trust in the tech sector, some element of trust? So Jasmine, why don't we start with you, if you don't mind?
Sure. Okay. So, I guess like a simple definition for trust for me, again, is willingness to be vulnerable. And that's a statement, but it's not like a blanket statement, because we allow ourselves to be vulnerable in ways that are less consequential and ways that are more consequential. So if I'm using Netflix, for example, and I'm going to allow the algorithm to give me some recommendations. Now, does Netflix always get it right as far as like the kind of things I want to watch? No, but it does what it's supposed to do. It gives me recommendations related to some entertainment, connected to some stuff I probably watched before, and other factors that it thinks it knows about me, right? Those recommendations are not as consequential as, should I be hired? Should I even get through the first round of hiring for a job? Should I be in that round of people considered for a kidney transplant or a vaccine, or whatever the case may be? But those are consequential decisions that are being made. So I might have some trust in a system that doesn't have that large impact on me, but with a system that could truly just screw up my life, I have some reservations. I'm not as willing to be vulnerable with that system unless it's a must do kind of thing. And I think there's obviously valid reasons for different kinds of trust and different kinds of systems. One, again, like I said, impact, but also history, context, continued stories related to the use of different kinds of algorithms or other technology or media for that case. I wouldn't be allowed back in my comm school if I didn't talk about just how regular media has its own issues or continued issues with respect to why people should or should not trust it. So just a willingness to be vulnerable, and vulnerability obviously is a spectrum of things.
Great, thank you. Dwayne, I'm wondering if you could answer the same question, and I'm guessing you might take a slightly more legal regulatory perspective on this.
Thanks. Yeah. So I just building on what Jasmine said in terms of the sort of different sort of degrees of trust depending on the application. I think that it's an important insight, and I would frame it sort of in the way of risk from the sort of legal side, and which is that in thinking about regulatory or other approaches to encouraging trustworthiness and good outcomes in tech, think about the risk and identify the things that appear to be high risks. And I think this also ties into some of the discussion in the opening remarks about having the right people in the room, making sure that you're thinking about individual versus group risks, understanding that some of these risks might be more specific to specific communities, and having the conversation at the beginning. Because ultimately, if you're talking about a sort of a tech regulatory approach, I mean, tech is ubiquitous. AI and algorithms are becoming ubiquitous. They range from Netflix recommendations to something driving your car, right? And people have different expectations and should have different expectations about what they want out of those, what level of trust they're willing to put in them, and what they need to earn that trust, whether it be a regulatory structure or a self-regulatory structure, or outputs that tell them why their car didn't crash, or just the cars don't crash. But that is a process piece. That I think at the beginning it's identifying the level of risk you have, and then you're going to have to calibrate your approach to build the trust to get to that level, and it will be different from getting in a car versus surfing the internet, I think.
Martin, I'm actually wondering if you might have some thoughts to follow up on that, particularly since you were talking about types of harm with respect to trust.
I mean, yeah, I have a question for all of us, which is, I think, going back at sort of conversations I've had on this topic, starting around like 2015, 2016, I think that the piece that I sort of, where I start to sort of like hit a wall is the question of how you define those high risk algorithms. And so like 5 or 6 years ago, I don't think there was such a consensus that it was important to do that. At this point, there's clearly a consensus. In the European context, I'm based in London, I'm French-British. The European Commission has put out both a data and AI strategy. The AI strategy talks about the notion of high-risk algorithms, doesn't say very much about how they would be defined. I think that, Jasmine, like your point about like consequential decisions is a really important one. Like, how do we as a community, how do we, look at the lessons from ethnography and other topics, Katie, to your point, about how you define high-risk algorithms, who gets to define that, and how then over time that gets further defined and iterated, so it's not a top-down process that gets sort of fixed in time. And so that's the thing that I'm stuck on, I'll say. So I can say that it's important to have a participatory process to determine what high risk means, that it needs to change over time, that it have to be reflective academic evidence and the lived experience of people most affected, and all that's very nice. But I actually, just to myself confess the limits, like that's what I'm hitting on, is that in practice, what would the recommendation be, to regulators on that side? Because to Dwayne's points, it's so all encompassing. So yeah, I think that's an important topic to discuss.
Katie, do you have any follow-up additional thoughts on this?
I think that panel has done a great job sort of covering definitions from both the people who are being asked to trust and the people asking for trust side. The one thing I would add is that, I'm interested in process and practice and good practice and what defines good practice. And so my head always goes straight to the practice, right? And I just want to highlight, Casey, your work on trying to understand how to project or how to understand risk on teams, right? And how to foresee risk coming, right? That sort of futureism that has to happen to have good practice around this data. And so I think that developing a set of common practices for that, exactly that sort of reflection where we say, what could this be used for, right? What risk could this have, is something that is missing right now that we need just a lot of work on. And Casey, I know you are leading the way on some of that, and the more of that, the better.
Yeah, that actually makes me think of the panel that we had at last year's conference around this time on future speculation for technology, which I think is a very interesting thing to be thinking about, both in the context of law and ethics. So actually, with that in mind, let me actually tweak a bit a question that I told you all I was going to pose for you about challenges. So I would be interested to know what you think is a particularly difficult challenge that we're facing right now when it comes to trust in the context of law and ethics in the tech sector. But you also might consider how you think this might be solved in the future. Or alternately, if you want to go down the speculative route, what do you think the biggest challenges we're going to face as we go into the future are? So why don't I start this time with Martin?
Sure. I think, I mentioned it, thank you. I mentioned it a little bit in my opening remarks. I think that one challenge is not to over-focus on the data only and to look at this as a data protection problem. And I could see in the United States a lot of time, energy, and bandwidth wasted while the house is burning to develop sort of a data protection type approach, a sort of GDPR for the US, which, whilst it may be good, I'm not persuaded would be the right call at this point in time. I think that's a major challenge. I'll list a couple of very quick ones. I think the second one is part of the solution is the intersection between consumer law, competition law, data protection law. How do we, how do we get there? And a third one is, I really think that part of what we need to get to is regulation around the use of automated decision-making algorithms, whether they are sort of more fancy machine learning or sort of more basic decision tree mechanisms. Jasmine, as you mentioned, like the basic automated decision-making can yet be highly discriminatory towards certain groups, and we have evidence of that. So I think the third challenge is like an algorithmic accountability act. What does that look like? Is that feasible in the US at a federal level? If it's not, what does it look like in practice at a sectoral level? And if sectoral is the way to go, what's the best place to start with? Would it, for example, be health, given the current crisis? And I think there are some lessons maybe from Europe that we can talk about later. Thanks.
Katie, what do you think are the biggest challenges we're facing or might face soon?
So one thing that I think is really challenging for those who are seeking trust is that I would speculate that we're operating in a broadly low trust environment in terms of trust in institutions, at least in the United States. I think that's different around the world. And so, Martin might be able to speak to the European context a bit better, but in the United States, we are already working in a system in which you cannot always trust the water, right? And so that problem of trust in institutions, in government, in already regulated sectors is low for good reason. And so trying to solve the problem of trust in tech while operating in this broader environment of mistrust and misinformation and all of the pieces that go with that is a huge challenge that we are going to have to sort of figure out both within the tech sector and more broadly in the US.
Jasmine, what do you think?
Okay. Well, I think there's a couple of challenges that are really important. One is the kind of fallback to transparency in law, and which is a good thing. We want to know, but it means absolutely nothing if we know and we can't do anything about it, right? So a company can say, look, we told you, and now what? You still got to use it, or we're still going to use it. And so transparency means nothing, one, if people don't understand what you're talking about still. We've had this discussion related to privacy policies or terms of service for a while now, where organizations will, hey, say we have a privacy policy, but if people, one, don't have time to read all that crap and don't understand what all is in it, it means absolutely nothing. And that's the same with when we talk about data collection, we talk about use of algorithms as well. Second thing is, there's a fallback in saying, like, if we just allow more people in the room or allow more people from marginalized or vulnerable communities in the room, that would change things. That's absolutely rubbish, because if you allow people in the room, one, first, the fact that you allow people in the room probably is the problem there, right? So that means that there's a limiting function automatically in place, allowing people in the room, allowing them a seat at the table. Like, wow, permission, that is so awesome. But also, if you allow them into the room, but they still have no power to make actual changes, nothing actually changes. You just have window dressing over the same issue over and over again. So like, we need a real conversation, but more than conversation, real moves to change compositions of different types of things, but also perspectives. And lastly, just thinking about ethics, but I want to say impact, right? And we have the creation of all different kinds of technology, not just AI or algorithms, but all different kinds of technologies, and they're pegged as problem-solving tools, ways for efficiency, ways of allowing us to do things faster or better or whatever the case may be. But when we want to solve problems, we have to look at whether or not we're actually creating more problems and who are the people that we're creating problems for. And so I think that risk assessments have to be kind of de rigueur, but risk assessments not just for the problem you think that you're solving, but all the other problems that are attached to it. Who is impacted by the thing that you are creating, the process, the software, whatever it is, because then we actually get to the meat of this problem. And it's not just the technology, it is the ignorance of all the impacts, all the people, all the other things that come along with the use of technology.
Thank you. Dwayne, what do you think is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now or might face soon for trustworthiness for AI?
I think that there are lots of challenges. One of the biggest challenges is that the technology moves very quickly. And the question is, like, how do the law or just generally norms and standards around industry keep up with it? I think that this is one of the reasons it's important to have, like an AI, this conversation about high level principles that's going on as a way of guiding that as a backstop before you get to a specific kind of regulatory approach, if you think that's the way to go. But embedded in that, I think it's also a challenge of whether or not you're looking at a potential regulatory perspective that is technology neutral or technology specific. There's definitely different models. I came from the FTC, which is a very tech neutral model, which has certain principles around what the FTC can enforce. Around a lot of it's around disclosure. That's because that's the statute, but there's also an unfairness authority there too as well. And then applying those in a way that doesn't really deal with any specific technology, but it has this existing law that it's applying. Versus, what does this look like in the future? Do you need specific kinds of regulations, especially in specific sectors? And really, it is so different. And one of the challenges of the just American regulatory system is it's so fragmented. You know, that I think the government's going to do its best, and you know, this White House is going to do its best to provide agency guidance on high-level principles that get then embedded in, you know, DOT when it comes to cars, for example, or the FCC or the FTC. But you know, it's a challenge, and there's always companies that are falling somewhere in the middle jurisdictionally. And the one additional thing I'll add is coming up with a good risk assessment. I would agree is critically important, and I really think that that is going to be an important part before you get to the regulatory piece of having a model of a risk assessment where it's not a checklist, it's a really think about not just the problem I'm trying to solve, but all the things can go wrong, and you know, the different points at which you need to surface and check risks. And in AI, in particular, this is true generally in tech, you know, we're talking about a life cycle, right? You know, the people who develop it, the people who use it, it gets deployed, it changes. You need to have risk assessments built in along the way. And I do think like some of the work that like NIST is doing, for example, to try to standardize that as much as possible is going to give, I think, important guidance.
And actually then, Dwayne, let me ask you a brief follow-up question, because you mentioned earlier that, you know, technology sometimes is kind of useless. We don't trust it at all. Are there any particular regulatory solutions that you might be in favor of or suggest that might help increase trust in technologies or companies?
Yeah, I'll give an example of a problem without being able to propose a solution, but COVID tracking apps, right? So this is something where, let's say that you want to do contact tracing by an app, and this requires someone to identify, perhaps anonymously, a COVID positive test, and you know, you can see there's just tons of very sensitive data that goes into this, right? If you wanted to do that, and I believe some countries have, this has not been successful in the US, you would need to have something that gives trust to a consumer that they can provide that information. In the current like framework that we have, different pieces of information are protected, health information are protected different ways. You know, HIPAA covers a lot of health information from your provider, but not something you're giving to an app. And you know, the sort of backstop to a lot of this is, what does their privacy policy say? So, and I can go on. I mean, but this is a problem. And if you want to build trust, you have to like go case by case, right? I think you'd have to have an entire panel or session or article on like what are all the gaps you need to fill to have a legal framework for that kind of information that doesn't just rely on the trust of the person who collects it not to give it to someone else. In order to build trust in it.
Great, thank you. Martin, what about you? Do you have any favored solutions, either regulatory or otherwise, for increasing trust, if you even think that's the goal?
I think increasing trustworthiness of the institutions is definitely the goal. I mean, I think, as I mentioned before, you know, the combination of transparency, which isn't enough, with real participation, with accountability is, I think, what's key. But to be more specific about it, you know, transparency is important. I agree, it means nothing if people can't do anything about it. But it is necessary, but not sufficient. I'll give one example. I really love the work of Arkon Fung on this. It goes back to sort of like 2008, 2009, I think, which was looking at cleanliness ratings for restaurants. Like, we talk about transparency generally quite broadly without thinking enough about, and I'm the first to do this, you know, not thinking enough about the audience. And so, you know, earlier in some ways I was talking really broadly about, yes, we want to know the existence, the purpose, the training data behind the algorithms. But, you know, as Jasmine and others have said, like, that's sort of information for intermediary organizations to then provide ways for the public to be able to engage. So at a very basic level, just like really targeted transparency. I'll give you an example in the UK, totally different example on the cleanliness of restaurants. If a place is serving food, there's a number rating, a cleanliness rating of 1 to 5. Like, my kids play sort of cleanliness bingo. When we walk around the streets, like, oh, Dad, like that's a 5, that's great, let's go eat there. And so as long as you trust, this is key, if you trust the oversight body and the institution that says that it is clean, you need to trust it. Your points about the degree to which it's a trust, I take that important point. I think that can be really helpful, you know, not just a sort of quantifiable piece of it, but the fact that it's really targeted and you know what it means. And then others, consumer bodies, you know, trade unions and others can like really get into it and see if the number is meaningful. But I think that's not a bad example. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So Katie, I know that you've been thinking more about kind of normative solutions for trust and trustworthiness. So what would you suggest?
So I actually think that the role of intermediaries, watchdog groups, is huge here. And that if there are sort of sets of practices that we can agree are important for spotting risk, for spotting injustices, then, you know, there's a role for other organizations, right, to sort of say, you know, this company isn't upholding their end of being trustworthy, right? So being trustworthy is both acting in trustworthy ways and projecting that in some way out into the world, right? And I think intermediary organizations, watchdogs, have a really important role in monitoring that. Is it compliance? I don't know. I don't love that word, but because I'm not a lawyer, that process, right? So thinking about who those groups are, how we support them, how we help them do that task is going to be a piece of rebuilding or building trust in this space.
Thank you. So I will give you all another reminder that you can be asking questions with the Q&A feature, because we'll be moving on to that pretty soon. And also if you can see what questions other people have asked to make sure that they rise to the top. So Jasmine, I think kind of to build on some of what Katie was just saying, you've been thinking about communities, and I'm curious what, you know, and made the great point that, you know, it's not a solution to say, you know, put more people in the room. So what do you think about ways we might shift trust in tech, maybe in either direction as is appropriate?
So I think I take what Martin said earlier as really important. So it's not the idea of having more trust in tech, but making organizations more trustworthy is probably the better goal for us. How can we require organizations and governments, don't want to leave them out, to act in ways or behave in ways that mitigate harm, to demonstrate that they are taking into account the possible impacts on people and other organizations for that matter. Various things we've talked about, transparency, but I think accountability. When it's not just good enough to have a story about how the algorithm is failing, but like, what are the repercussions for failure in these cases? When there's actual harm that's happening, is it just like, oh, we can stop using the algorithm now? Or is there some kind of, you had a responsibility there and now there's some kind of repercussion for not taking into account that responsibility, right? So I think those kinds of things, you know, there's been research related to what people, the kinds of expectations people have for organizations when they are using automation or automated systems, and how people, you know, feel betrayed, if you can use that kind of word, related to when organizations aren't taking accountability or they're using systems that are failing with respect to the decisions that they mete out. And so I think it's really important to think about the expectations of people who are impacted, not users necessarily, but people who are impacted. There's an impact on those people, those communities related to what's happening.
Great, thank you. So we have a number of questions already, and I want to make sure that we're able to get to some of them. So we're going to officially start the Q&A, and as is the tradition here at Silicon Flatirons, our first question will come from a student. So Brian, welcome to the panel.
Hi, everyone. Well, my name is Brian Hinden. I'm a 1L here at CU. I wanted to first start before getting into the questions by just thanking you for an extremely valuable and insightful conversation. It was really fantastic to hear your varying perspectives on trust in this ever-developing space of technology. And I guess my first question would be, before we get into the Q&A sector, I hear a lot of emphasis based on how we build trustworthiness in institutions and how that is kind of a cardinal principle of how we're going to move forward in this rapidly developing space. And I wonder whether it's from global influence or something that you've emerged within the United States, do you think there is a general best practice to rebuild faith institutionally and in organizations that have otherwise kind of fallen under this dark cloud of criticism and a lack of trust in the last couple of years?
Does anyone want to volunteer to take that first?
I'll take a crack at it. I think that it's a pretty big question about declining trust in institutions, and probably it's helpful to think about it different from the public sector and the private sector. I think for in terms of where government regulation plays, I think it's important, and I don't have a quick solution to rebuild trust in whatever regulatory body is going to enforce the rules in order to have the trust sort of trickle down. In terms of individual like entities in the private sector, I mean, I think the task at hand isn't, I think that someone said this earlier, the goal isn't just to sort of rehabilitate and get them more, or the goal isn't to get people to think that they're trustworthy. The goal is to make them do things that fit with trustworthiness, and however we get there should be the goal, and will then lead to folks actually having more trust in them.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So we have a few questions here. I would encourage people to ask more using the Q&A feature if you have them. I'm actually not, well, I suppose we'll experiment here as the first panel. I'm not entirely sure how easy it is for someone to come ask their question out loud, but I will ask if Derek Shumway would like to ask your question out loud, but if not, I can definitely just pass that on. That might be okay. Are we able to? I think there's a let Derek speak button. Excellent. Welcome.
Hi there. Are you able to hear and see me?
We can hear you, which is sufficient for question asking if you like.
All right, perfect. Well, so my question is in response to Jasmine or anyone else there. I'm just a reporter here for a news media company in Washington, D.C. as a student doing an internship. And my question over privacy policies is as consumers, as normal college students or moms and dads or whoever we are, everyone is concerned and upset about how long these privacy policies and terms and conditions and never-ending checkboxes are, that they're so ridiculous and complex. And I agree that it's true, it is complex and long, but I feel that it's our own fault that we've caused companies by slapping them with regulation and complaint after complaint. That I wonder, do you feel like that the consumer ought to be willing to give up some of what they perceive as our privileges and rights in order to simplify these legal regulations that companies can be held more accountable, so that consumers can't just complain and file complaint after complaint, that we'll have to concede something in order to make it more simpler for them?
No, I don't think users or consumers should have to give up rights related to those things. I think it's kind of it's kind of bad to think of organizations as not having the ability to be creative. I mean, they're creative with a whole lot of things. They can be creative with language. Hire some UC students, hire some UF students, hire some Maryland students in the advertising department, the persuasive communication department, and they can come up with a lot of language, one, that people can understand, but not just language. I think it's all kinds of expression that gets across what is actually happening when people use their system, their technology, would they subscribe, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of different ways of getting that across. What has fallen back is, what I should say, what organizations have fallen back on is using a whole lot of legalese to express what's happening, but that opaqueness of that language is, one, kind of purposeful, and two, just doesn't, it's transparent in that it gives us information, but it doesn't actually allow people to understand. I think there's a lot of different ways of helping people to understand what's happening, but organizations have chosen not to. There are some organizations that do a way better job in helping people, whether it's using animations or graphics or whatever the case may be, and organizations can do that. It's whether or not they're choosing to is the issue.
Great, thank you. Martin, do you have a follow-up thought to this?
I do. I agree with Jasmine that people shouldn't give up on their individual rights. But I think rather part of the answer is what the panel was discussing earlier. It's the role of watchdogs and intermediary organizations. The crazy situation we're in. Like, I want all the information. I want, like, you know, I want the information in those 70-page consent forms to be available, not because I want to read them, because I want Consumer Report to read them. You know, I want the watchdogs to read them and to do the job for me. That's what civil society is there for. This is what living in a society is about. And I think the crazy situation we're in is that we put all the agency on the individuals for them to be responsible, you know, to like read through it and then tick, and it's my agency. And that's the point I was trying to make earlier in terms of like where the agency is. Is it on the individual or is it on those that represent us? Sometimes it's the state, sometimes it's civil society organizations. Consumer Reports is a good example, or Which in the UK. And I think it's that link that we need to make, you know, that we need to make clearer.
Great, thank you. So to keep us moving along, I'm going to pose a question first to Dwayne from Martha, which is this point that maybe it's not impossible to eliminate bias. This is part of what makes us human. So shouldn't the key be to recognize and manage bias rather than assuming that there isn't any?
Yeah, so I definitely think that's the case. There is going to be bias in anyone who's working on tech generally, certainly in AI systems. And I certainly think that managing bias is critical to doing that. I think Dr. Turner-Lee said earlier, there's and I'm paraphrasing. This is foolish of me to try to paraphrase something she said, because she always says it better. But the machines aren't biased; it's the people who are biased. Then they encode it into the machines, and that's right. And so I think it's a multifaceted approach. One thing is figuring out what the biases are that we have into anything that we program, and the second piece is finding ways to do to root out the bias, to figure out what potential bias outcomes there are, measure them, categorize them, mitigate them, and try to solve for it. I mean, and it has to be done, particularly in AI, at different stages of the life cycle. So I think it is both.
Great, thank you. And actually, this next question I think is a nice follow-up for you based on that, particularly as the lawyer working in the AI space here. So what do you see as the current level of trust between lawyers and AI developers? As Ron points out, when they show up in the conversation, to what extent are they collaborating versus in conflict?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think generally in the tech space, my experience is regulatory lawyers are usually telling people no if they want to do cool products, or at least saying, whatever. Because that's when you get engaged. And AI specifically, and I joke a bit, but a lot of it is saying like watch out, these are the laws in the space. Here are the things you should be thinking about. Bringing the lawyer perspective to somebody who it might not be thinking about it. And of course, there's other people who are also involved in company as well. But I think in AI specifically, the conversation needs to develop more, because AI, or I would say algorithms, and AI generally, are embedded in so much developing technology that I'm not sure, and there's no overarching framework yet. It's developing, right? So outside of specific areas like privacy, I think that it's still an ongoing conversation, and it's incumbent upon I feel like me in the legal profession to really try to engage as much with technologists and understand what's going on and really do that. I mean, I think it has to move forward. And I think having a lot of these tools like risk frameworks and standards and a lot of just like the terminology around AI will go a long way to facilitating that conversation, because they are meant to be sort of multi-stakeholder and make sense both to like technologists, product people, lawyers, policymakers, et cetera.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna, so first of all, again, to the audience, please ask more questions. I'm gonna start by posing one that we have here to start with to Katie. So this is a question from Avery, who points out that there's been a lot of talk about watchdogs. So what do we mean by watchdogs? Could this mean more journalists reporting on tech, or a government audit committee, or companies having dedicated officers, et cetera?
Yeah, I love this question. I mean, yes, the answer is yes, all of these things, right? But I think we can think a little systematically about which ones might be sort of where we want to put our energy first, right? So there are already great organizations, nonprofits doing this kind of work, right? Center for Democracy and Technology, or the ACLU. And so thinking about how to keep that sector super engaged, right? They're nonprofits, right? They have to figure out how to fund themselves, right? So we have to think a little bit about how we support that existing group of watchdogs. I think journalists do actually an amazing job on this as well. And again, another sector we need to think about how to systematically support so that they can do that work. I think there's a lot of room here for new kinds of intermediaries. 10 years ago, I worked a little bit on the idea of data vaults and data fiduciaries, right? And I don't know how to create a new industry. That's way outside of my expertise, right? But something like that, right? I think there's a lot of space right now to think through. Is there something missing that we need to build trust in this, or to help build trust in this sector, right? Companies need to change, researchers need to change. There's going to be have to be a whole lot of change. But do we need a missing piece here? I think there's perhaps a missing type of organization here, but then big questions come up about how to support that and how to make that realistic, and what access do they have to the actual practice and process within tech companies. We've talked on the Pervade team with Casey about the ethics watchdogs within these Silicon Valley companies. Our colleague Jake Metcalf, Manny Moss have done really interesting work where they've been interviewing ethics owners, the people who Silicon Valley companies have hired in the last 5 years to deal with ethics within the company, and they have thankless jobs. It's a difficult, miserable job, because they are pushing against the logics of capitalism in these companies, right? Without a lot of support or even understanding of sort of how they're supposed to do that job, or what success looks like in that job. So that's another space that we could be thinking about systematically and propping, and sort of helping to develop is what constitutes success in those jobs, and how do we help those people have a better time of it.
I think that's a great point. And I think another important thing is that there are increasingly people who are interested in these kinds of jobs, perhaps maybe even some of the students in the audience right now. So I'm gonna address the next question first to Martin, because I think you've been thinking about this kind of thing. So the question is, how do you enforce a data bill of rights globally? if globally we don't necessarily share or enforce equal values on data sensitivity?
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a great question. What I might do is I might break it up a little bit. And I think before talking about enforcing it, just like, is it feasible? And so I think the first question is like identify shared values around the world on these topics. We've done it in the past. We did it with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think it's really important to learn from other cultures on these topics. I think other cultures have a lot to bring us when it comes, for example, to the issue of collective rights and collective responsibility. For example, there's not much point owning your personal data in India if a cell phone is used by a family. And if you have sort of 6 or 7 people using the same cell phone, using the same mobile phone. So I think that's a really important conversation and discussion to have collaboratively. And then I think the enforcement piece, in some ways, like how to enforce it is almost easier once you have it, which is nationally. I think the enforcement would be national, as is the case with human rights. So I think it's something that we're excited to do and to learn from. I've been having conversations with activists, with academics. I mentioned India, in Kenya, learning about the concept and the importance of collective responsibility in different cultures and the link between collective responsibility, collective rights, and individual rights. So I think that's a key conversation to have. And if we get stuck in our own national boundaries, multinational, transnational, global corporations will just be dancing all around us on these types of issues and playing a game of smoke and mirrors. So I think it is crucial.
I think that's a great point, particularly the cooperative aspect of that. So I next have a question from Brian, and I'm wondering if maybe Katie or Jasmine might have some thoughts on this. So first, he's quoting Tim Cook here. If a business is built on misleading users, on data exploitation, on choices that are no choices at all, then it does not deserve our praise, it deserves reform. So the question is whether the ethics of corporate policies, which might be things like privacy or data protection, drive changes in industry, or has the train already left the station? Will we see more regulatory engagement or media attention? Is there a sort of simplified trolley problem of ethics that might be used to convey the importance of this to people who are viewing private data as meh? Do either of you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I'm happy to. This is a great question. There's a lot in here, but I mean, to some degree, and maybe it's just where I sit working on tech ethics and tech policy, but I actually think this change is happening. So, you know, again, when I started working on these issues 10, 15 years ago, the feeling really was that the train had left the station. And this was sort of in the privacy space, right? That was privacy, that privacy was dead, privacy, blah, blah, blah. Why are you working on privacy? Literally no one asked me that question anymore, right? Nobody asked me why I'm working on data and privacy. And AI has I don't want to say solved that problem because it's presented an entirely new set of problems, but it has changed the public narrative on the challenges and dangers of these technologies. And it has also changed another narrative I want to point to that it's changed super interestingly is people used to try to convince me that tech was neutral, right? It was just a tool, it's a hammer, people can use it however they want. AI has changed that conversation, right? Nobody thinks of tech as neutral, and very few people. I mean, there are still people who argue this, but the dominant narrative around tech is changing to one of needing regulation, of individual and community level rights. I think this conversation is really changing, and I think that AI and I wish we hadn't had to have had the crises that we've had to get here, right? Like we could have moved on this 10 years ago, it would have been a better situation. But I do think that public attention around these things. And so the question of what is the trolley problem is really interesting, but I think it's AI tragedies in healthcare. I think it's AI tragedies in criminal justice. I think it's these disasters that have happened are at least when I teach, they are the examples I give, and the students say, oh yeah, right, we need to do something about this. This is not just.
So we have about 5 minutes left. So I thought I might ask you all for any closing thoughts, particularly as we're about to go into the rest of the conference. Perhaps what is something that you would like everyone to be thinking about over the next few days as we grapple with these issues? Dwayne, how about you?
I think there's so much to discuss. I'm really interested in a lot of really sort of like almost like process points around how we get to trust. Like, what are the institutions and how do we build them? I'm really intrigued by the discussion around third party, essentially civil society or institutions that can assist with this. I'm really interested in the development of sort of, voluntary frameworks or sort of consensus frameworks around a lot of these issues. And there's a lot of discussion going on, as I mentioned, going back to AI, but like, in just different government bodies or different fora. And hopefully they'll converge. I mean, they're converging around a number of similar principles, but like, what is the process going forward and how do we keep these conversations going? Because that ultimately be the test from just going to talking about these important issues of trust to them actually having some effect.
Great, thank you. I definitely think that how do we keep these conversations going is going to be something really important over the next few days. Jasmine, what about you?
Looking forward to continuing, obviously, this discussion, but to also getting people to think that just because it's hard to do doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And I never think the train has left the station. It is possible to shut a train down. And so that's also something we probably should be thinking about as well. When we think about harm, when we think about impacts, when we think about who's losing out, and that's really important.
Just because it's hard to do doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Yes, let's please all remember that. Martin, what about you?
I'll come back to this issue of identifying those high-risk algorithms. I think a lot of it at that point, not everything, but starts with that. And as a number of the panelists made the point, just like coming out with those good risk assessments, that's really important. And then if those are identified and we have a system to continue to iterate on them, then the watchdogs can get to work, both governmental ones and civil society ones. So I think there's a lot in that. And as I mentioned, like I've been hitting my head on that for a number of years and I would love to have some help. So I'm very much in a market for good ideas.
Excellent, thank you. And Katie, why don't you close us out with some thoughts to leave people with?
Yeah, so I agree with Jasmine and Martin, and that, and just want to add that figuring this out, this problem that is hard, this problem of identifying high risks, is going to take a lot of forms of knowledge. And so panels like this, and I'm really excited that Flatiron, is putting together groups like this to talk. I think we're going to have to think a lot about how to have these conversations broadly and what the models for those conversations might be, right? What sort of form of participatory democracy works for figuring out this very complex technical set of questions around high risks. And yeah, I don't think we have any answers, but we need to be thinking about all the forms of knowledge that need to be in that room, or those rooms, many rooms.
Great, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for a fascinating conversation. I, at least, and I'm sure they as well, would be happy to talk to people at our virtual hallways to continue this conversation, or offline in various ways. And I hope that this conversation helps frame the rest of what's happening at the conference. Thank you all to everyone who has been watching. I will now turn this over to Victoria Vinzer to kick off the next event.